Welcome to Golcar, often likened to an Italian hill town because of its cottages piled almost on top of one another, and its maze of alleyways, ginnels and steep stone steps. It may have an Italian look about it, but this Doomsday Book village is as Yorkshire as they come, and so am I, even though my married surname is Polish. I was born and brought up in Golcar as Beryl Thompson. For most of my childhood, we lived in a cottage over there at Ridings Lane. Before the Industrial Revolution, Golcar was a hotbed of handloom weavers who took full advantage of their south-facing cottages to weave cloth in the sunlight which lasted all day. One group of three-storey cottages is now the award-winning Colne Valley Museum. It is here, in the very heart of old Golcar, that we start our circular heritage walk to highlight some of the village's colourful history. One of these three cottages was used as a Socialist Club from 1906 to 1970, when a modern new club was built at the other end of the village. The move gave birth to the idea of creating a museum in the old cottages, formerly known as Spring Rock, and a museum trust was set up to preserve them. Over 3 decades, the museum, which is run entirely by volunteers, has been developed so that today it is an authentic replica of a handloom weaver's home in the middle of the last century. On the ground floor of the museum is the kitchen, furnished and equipped as it would have been in the mid-Victorian period, which is used from time to time to demonstrate bread baking, biscuit making, and other traditional culinary crafts. The welcoming open fire has a range that was used for baking, cooking, heating water, and warming flat irons, used to put the finishing touches to the family washing. This busy scene in the kitchen reminds me of our house when I was a girl. My mother used to make white bread on Tuesdays and brown on Thursdays. The ground floor also features a weaver's living room or parlour. The floor is of stone flags, partly covered by peg rugs made from pieces of woolen rags pegged into canvas, which was stretched over a frame. On the walls of the parlour are a number of samplers, which would have been made by the women of the family to show off their needlework skills. These particular samplers are quite large and elaborate, and as such are a tribute to the dexterity of their maker. The wooden rack hanging from the ceiling was known as the bread flake. In the early part of the 19th century, it would have been used for homemade oat cakes, but later on, its main use was for airing clothes and drying off bunches of herbs. A Victorian wash kitchen has been recreated in a room at the rear. Here are all the utensils used on wash day. There is a collection of mangles, with handles to turn the wooden rollers through which the newly washed clothes were passed to squeeze out the water. We also have possers for stirring clothes while they were soaking in the ash tub, and rubbing boards on which the clothes were scoured clean with plenty of soap. On the first floor is the museum shop, which stocks a wide range of souvenirs and gifts besides serving light refreshments. There is also the Guy Crowther exhibition room, named after the Colne Valley textile boss, who was a founder trustee of the museum and the first treasurer, and a lecture room. On the top floor we come to the workshop, also known as the loom chamber, where handloom weaving is recreated on 2 looms dating back to the turn of the century. As we watch the weaver at work, it's easy to see why long windows were invaluable to let in as much daylight as possible. Also in the workshop is a spinning jenny, which was used to create yarn for weaving from freshly combed wool. In the adjoining spinning and cropping room, we go back to the early 18th century, before the spinning jenny was invented. It also precedes the invention of the cropping frame, which provoked the notorious Luddite riots in 1812. Also on the top floor is a remarkable and totally authentic Clogger Shop, as it was from the early years of this century. The traditional Clogger Shop in Carr Lane, Slathwaite, belonging to the late Albert Parkin, was about to be cleared in the 1970s. Volunteers from the museum were given permission to remove the contents, so they started the mammoth task of taking out the whole lot and setting it all up again in the museum. So was recreated Mr. Parkin's workshop, complete with benches, tools and gas lights. Some museum members have now acquired the traditional clogger's skills and are able to make old-fashioned clogs with wooden soles and leather uppers. Clogger Duncan Bowman says the museum is a popular tourist attraction.
Yes, we get about 10,000 visitors each year, and we're only open on a weekend. During the week, however, in term time, school parties come round the museum, and the school children all dress up and participate in life as it would have been in the mid-Victorian period, and they have a thoroughly good time while they're here. The school party visits are part of an educational service that we provide, and the visit complies entirely with the national curriculum.
Long before tourists started coming to the village, a legend arose about Golcar folk which lives on today. According to the legend, people living in the village are known as Golcar Lilies, but which of several versions as to why they are so called remains a talking point. If you are a romantic, you may well choose the belief that it's a glowing tribute to the lily-like fresh complexions of Golcar's young ladies. Nature lovers probably prefer the version that hundreds of years ago, Golcar's steep hillsides were covered by an abundance of lilies of the valley, which flourished on land fed by a network of underground streams. Some folk say that the name owes its origins to the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, who is said to have described the residents of Golcar as lilies compared to the savages he met in the nearby communities of Scapegoat Hill and Bolster Moor. Possibly the most likely version is that the symbol of the lily was introduced to the village at the end of the 17th century by a group of people called the Huguenots, who fled from religious persecution in France. Many Huguenots are reputed to have settled in Golcar and brought with them banners bearing the lily insignia. Our walk begins as we leave the museum and move up the cobbled street of Cliff Ash and turn left into the heart of the shopping centre at Town End, where there is the village's one remaining co-op store. In bygone days, there were co-op shops dotted all round Golcar, which had two entirely independent cooperative societies. There was the Golcar Cooperative Society, which had its main store in Brook Lane, with branches at Town End and Botham Hall. This society was known locally as the Yer Quop, because its management committee was dominated by Liberals. A rival co-op, called the Golcar Central Working Men's Co-op, was patronised by many Conservatives, and so became known as the Blue Quop. Its main shop was in James Street, but it also had a branch in Jubilee Square. In addition, there was a large shop at the junction of Lanemoor Road and Sycamore Avenue, run by the Longwood Cooperative Society, which is now a supermarket owned by Booler Brothers. Right. I used to come to this co-op at Townend on errands, and I always had to give our co-op number. I can still remember it. This was number 384. This was done so that when the co-op profits were shared out amongst its members, everybody got a fair share. The co-op sold groceries, butter and lard from barrels, and flour and sugar from sacks. These were weighed out as needed and then made into parcels with stiff white paper. Moving on into Jubilee Square, the dominant feature is a comparatively new war memorial. The story behind the memorial and the charitable group who built it is quite remarkable. The idea of building a memorial at Jubilee Square was first raised in September 1989 at a meeting of the Winkle Club, a men-only organisation formed in 1980 and based at the Rising Sun pub in the village. Money which they give to local needy causes is raised through a system of fines ranging from 10p to 50p, all involving the winkle, a tiny seashell which members are supposed to carry with them at all times. If a member is challenged to show his winkle and cannot do so, he is automatically fined. Fines are also imposed on any member found to have inadvertently revealed his winkle to a non-member, and a member caught not wearing his Winkle Club tie on a Friday. Thousands of pounds have been raised by the Winklers, who take their rules very seriously indeed. One unfortunate member even had to cough up a fine when he was unable to produce his winkle when challenged while recovering from an operation in hospital. After the proposal to build a memorial was adopted by the club, members took the lead in raising over £1,000 to pay for it. The 12-foot high stone structure was completed in October 1990 to create a new landmark in the village centre in remembrance of those who died in 2 world wars. The Winkle Club's chairman, Peter Wrigley, nicknamed Chewy because of his surname, explains exactly how the club came to be formed and why they built the war memorial.
The Winkle Club was formed by a chap called Alex Casey Brown, who in actual fact was the first £1,000 signing for Fartown. He supplied all the original winkles, which members had to buy for £1 each. The first idea of to build a war memorial came from Mr. Alan Livesey, because the only one we had was inside the church, and we okayed it with the British Legion and the council eventually, and decided to raise the funds for what you see now.
On the right, as we pass through Jubilee Square, is ST Shaw's, which until about 50 years ago was the only chemist shop in Golcar, along with a sister branch in James Street. It is still a family business, but a photographic finishing firm, owned and run by the son of the chemist's founder, has been moved to Morley and is under new ownership. The photographic works, which was in Scarborough Terrace at one time, provided quite a few job opportunities in the summer months because they developed and printed films for a number of large firms, including Boots. I worked there for a number of happy years, including the wartime period, when our work included special orders for the government. Walking from Jubilee Square down Lamoor Road, we see on our left the Rising Sun, which towards the end of the last century had strong connections with horse racing that took place in the village. Stables for the racehorses were built onto the pub, but they were demolished many years ago, Nowadays, you might occasionally come across horses being ridden purely for pleasure, but 100 years ago, when Golcar was a much smaller place than it is today, they were ridden regularly for big money when there was a huge area of open land off Lamoor Road called Golcar Flats. Most of the land has now been built on, but it was on that wide open space that horse races were run between 1875 and 1885. The steeplechase grew into a feature event, which in the first running had a top prize of £15, but later became a hefty purse of 40 sovereigns. The races became an attraction which drew thousands of spectators. A few years before they were discontinued, part of the grandstand collapsed, and many people had to jump to safety. Fortunately, there were no more serious injuries than bruises and sprains. There were grandiose plans for a new and better racecourse, featuring the Derby of the North. The plans never materialised, but a group of houses which were built on the proposed site on the other side of Lamoor Road were given the name Darby Fields. Besides a number of flat races, there was also a steeplechase, all of which were first introduced as an added attraction at the annual Golcar Floral, Horticultural and Pig Society exhibition. One tangible reminder of the locally famous Golcar Races remains. It is an inkwell made from a hoof of one of the best horses, called Lady Golightly, and it is rightly prized by its owners, Pat Horsfall and her sister Jean. Pat explains how the inkwell came into their possession.
Lady Golightly was my grandfather's horse, James Horsfall, and she won many races, including the President's Cup. My grandfather was the landlord of the Rising Sun Inn, and the horse was stabled at the back of the pub. When my grandfather died, they had the horse's hoof made into an inkwell, which was passed down to my father, and when my father married, of course it was in the family, and then my mother had it, and she has passed it down to her two daughters, myself and Jean. We are now the present owners. Our intention for the horse's hoof is that when we are gone, and when one of our relatives is having it, that it will be passed down eventually to the Colne Valley Museum as a piece of local history. The races were a big attraction for many years, and even had their own song. Ting-a-ling went the bell, they're off, the folk did yell. Like lightning round the course they ran, the donkey first, and then Mary Ann. Somebody cried, "Whoa!" The moke wouldn't go. She lifted him over the gate, and in less than a crack, she jumped on his back and won the Golcar plate.
On the opposite side of Lamoor Road to what remains of Golcar Flat is the site of what used to be the village cinema. The cinema was called the Ritz for many years, but at one time was named the Alhambra, although neither was used much when I was growing up in Golcar. We always called it simply Lamoor Pictures, and it was a big attraction for young and old when the popularity of the silver screen was at its peak. After it closed as a cinema, the building was used for many years by Jeff Clifford as a workshop for making and restoring furniture. Now nothing remains of the place where Golcar folk were entertained for several decades. But at least the cinema is commemorated by the name The Picture House, given to houses built on the site. On the right-hand side, as we continue down Lamoor Road, is a terrace of houses which used to be called the Brass Knob Row, because the people who lived in there always kept a shine on their brass door handles. After turning right from Lamoor Road into Sycamore Avenue, there is the former Socialist Club, which was built to replace the cottage handed over to become part of the museum at Cliff Ash. Incidentally, the Old Cottage Club did not sell beer for the first 10 years of its life, but was purely a meeting place for socialists who were denied permission to hold meetings in the church and chapel halls. The club at Cliff Ash was the starting point for the famous torchlight procession of the 1907 by-election. The procession was led by Victor Grayson, who went on to win a victory that put Colne Valley firmly on the political map, and finished in James Street, where Grayson spoke to a huge crowd, reported to number about 3,000 people. The new club in Sycamore Avenue was officially opened in 1969 by Dennis Healy, who was then Secretary of State for Defence. With a concert hall seating 600, the new club flourished in the 1970s, and a bar extension was opened by Harold Wilson when he was leader of the opposition. But as the club craze in the north of England went into decline, the Golcar venture ran into financial difficulties. It dropped its Socialist Club title in the 80s and is now a privately run entertainment centre. Former club president Ivor Fallas, who laid the new club's foundation stone, agrees it was an ambitious venture.
It was at this time that we realised that the old club was no longer suitable for the entertainment of that time. Therefore this club was built and we attracted such stars as Marty Wilde, PJ Proby, Acker Bilk, Marty Kane. And on the official opening, the main entertainer was Charlie Williams. And it was from the proceeds of these funds that we were able to make a profit each year and consequently kept the club going and paid off the debt to the brewery. But unfortunately, in the 80s, club life seemed to deteriorate and the club slowly went down.
After going through the huge Sycamore Avenue council estate, we turn right up Scar Lane, where there are several large detached houses built by well-to-do Colne Valley industrialists of a bygone age. On the right-hand side of Scar Lane, as we near a road junction, is the building which was the town hall when Golcar had its own urban district council, until it became part of Colne Valley Council in 1937. It was originally a private residence and is now used by the Community Health Services. At the Scar Lane Road junction, where we bear right up Knoll Road, stands the aptly named Junction Public House. It is an inn with a long history, where many years ago a coroner's inquest was held into a triple fatality on the railway. Near a footbridge called Nancy Bridge, not far from Golcar Station, 3 platelayers were walking along the tracks when they were hit by a train and killed instantly. The bodies were found by another platelayer and were taken to the Junction pub. At the inquest, the coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death and added a rider calling for greater care to be taken by railway workers when walking along the tracks. On the left-hand side of Knoll Road, just after passing the Junction pub, is the old Knoll Bank School, built in 1816. But no longer used as a school. The school won nationwide fame in the 1920s through the remarkable achievements of its talented young singers, inspired by their music-loving Welsh headmaster John Griffiths. The school choir, conducted by Mr. Griffiths, twice won first prize at the Welsh National Eisteddfod, first in 1922 and again in 1926. Their 1922 success at Ammanford was pulled off in extraordinary circumstances and was hailed in the press as a great victory for a humble village school. Knoll Bank, the only English choir competing, defied the weather as well as 27 rival Welsh choirs to perform a giant-killing act in appalling conditions. A survivor of the 1922 triumph, Miss Dorothy Garside, was 10 years old at the time. She recalls that Mr. Griffiths was so strict that he wouldn't let them eat a single sweet on the day of the Eisteddfod in case it affected their voices. Miss Garside reads from a newspaper report of the day, which she still cherishes.
The day came at last, and the mail train, which hurled nightly through the village, made an unheard-of stop at the station to take aboard the party of excited children and anxious mothers. There were also hampers of food put on the train, which Mr. Hurst and Wilkinson Lockwood gave. Monday morning found them further from home than they had been before, in a country with a foreign language and unpronounceable place names. Tuesday was the wettest day of that year. The rain turned the field in which the huge pavilion was built into a quagmire to be crossed on quaking duckboards. The children's feet were damp, the girls' carefully curled hair grew straight, the mothers' feelings were indescribable. A preliminary round in the local theatre had reduced the large class of competing choirs to 6, the village school among them. At least, said the headmaster, they will sing in that great pavilion before an audience of thousands. They'll remember that all their lives. The Welsh choirs rose to sing. They wore uniforms. They marched onto the platform to the strains of Men of Harlech. They sang like angels, and the audience of 9,000 roared their applause. Next came the turn of the school choir, Yorkshire. They scrambled untidily onto the platform. They looked bedraggled, crumpled, left out in the rain. Their conductor raised his baton, and they forgot their discomfort and their strange surroundings, and they sang for him as he had taught them to sing in the village schoolroom at home. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then the vast audience of music lovers rose and acclaimed them, and the judges gave their first prize. Their return home was dramatically in keeping with the rest of the story. The village put out the flags and hired a brass band which met them at the station and led them through the streets between the cheering ranks of their relatives and friends. A most fitting end to a Yorkshire victory came with a huge and satisfying tea in the schoolroom.
A few months later, the choir gave a concert in the village when members were presented with gold medals and photographs of the choir and their conductor in recognition of their achievement. 4 years later came the choir's second Eisteddfod victory, this time against 23 opponents, when the festival was held at Swansea. The adjudicators were once more lavish in their praise of the Golcar children. In one test piece, the judges said the singing had a charming tone and purity and perfection, and in the other, the choir had given an absolutely superb performance of high distinction. The choir's successes seem to have been marked by a total lack of stage fright, even though they were singing in strange surroundings and in front of huge audiences. For the children, most of whom had never been far from home, the trips to the Eisteddfod were a great adventure, lasting the best part of a week. They travelled overnight on the Sunday by train from Golcar and stayed with residents of Mr. Griffith's home village of Llanstefan. Their class at the Eisteddfod was held on the Tuesday, and on Wednesday and Thursday they had trips to the Welsh coast before travelling home on the Friday. Mrs. Nancy Burrell, who still lives in Golcar, was a member of the 1926 choir.
In 1926 was a big moment for me. I went to, when the Eisteddfod was at Swansea, and we boarded the midnight train at Golcar and arrived in Carmarthen, it would be then, and then went on a short coach ride to Llanstefan, where again the same procedure was, groups of children with parents. And our Stepford was in Swansea. That time we were giving concerts and had various trips, and each time we went, we always had to, whichever town we went to or village, we had to stand in a corner and always sing Land of My Fathers. That was a done thing, because we felt very Welsh at that time. The Stepford was held in big marquees in a big field, I can remember. And early on in the day, we would take a preliminary test, and then the finals were held later in the day. It was absolutely full of people. There was an audience of about 8,000 people, and we just marched onto the stage and sung our hearts out, just as we'd been taught to do, because Mr. Griffiths was a perfectionist, and which quite clearly shows with the results of the competition, the high marks which were awarded, and the remarks were absolutely out of this world. I've never heard them in a competition, and I've been going to musical competitions practically all my adult life anyway. I can still remember the adjudicator's remarks after one performance. This again is absolutely superb. The lovely lofty tone is ravishing to the senses. The phrasing is still more perfect. The way they dovetailed the phrases was distinctly clever, a performance of high distinction.
The school choir was formed in 1905 and soon made its mark under Mr. Griffith's leadership by winning the first prize at the Mrs. Sunderland Festival in Huddersfield in 1906 and 1907. A poignant forerunner to the choir's formation is the sad story of Ida May Heg, who at a school concert in 1900 emerged as a wonderful 8-year-old soprano. Her fame spread and she received a flood of singing engagements. It seemed she had the world at her feet, but tragically her life was ruthlessly cut short when, after a week's illness, she died in 1904 at the tender age of 12. Immediately opposite the former school building is Providence Methodist Church, which began life in 1876, when Sunday school classes were held in a classroom at the Knoll Bank School. A purpose-built chapel to seat 450 people was erected 3 years later, when many of the local Methodists did the unskilled work. But it soon became apparent that this was too small, and in 1882 plans were prepared for a new chapel. As the work neared completion, it was decided to add a clock with an illuminated dial and brass bell to the front of the church. A crisis arose with the death in 1884 of Providence's devoted leader, Joseph Taylor, and there was not enough money to finish the building. But the problem was overcome when the whole of his estate was handed over to the church's top 3 pioneers. The new chapel was opened in 1885, and by 1912 all the debts had been cleared. During the Second World War, members of the church created a remarkable record by writing a grand total of 13,088 letters to fellow churchmen and women serving in the forces. 1947 was a red letter day when electricity was installed, and the church prospered in the immediate post-war years. Particular emphasis was placed on keeping up its proud music-making tradition. As church attendances in general dwindled a few decades ago, the church was sold and is now an old people's home. All the services and meetings are held in the original chapel building. Further along Knoll Road, on the right-hand side, as we walk towards the village centre, is the popular Weaver's Shed restaurant, which stands on the site of Acre Mill. Fred Taylor had an electrical engineering workshop there around the turn of the century, and it was he who had the brainwave to launch the Golcar Steamship Company in 1898. Taylor set himself up as the company's marine engineer and roped in his wealthy friend George Shaw, a stockbroker who lived at Botham Hall, to handle the financial side of the venture. Shaw's brother-in-law, a Mr. Allen, was enlisted to act as manager from his offices in Glasgow. The newly born company bought a 7-year-old steamship for £7,250 and renamed it the SS Golcar. In no time at all, business was booming, and profits in the first year topped £1,500. Quite a lot of money in those days. In 1899, the trio started a sister firm called the Longwood Steamship Company, which operated an SS Longwood. This was a 5-year-old vessel which cost them £9,200. In the first few years, the company steamed ahead to bring handsome dividends for shareholders, but stormy waters lay ahead. The Golcar Company replaced their steamer with another named the SS Cape Corrientes, which, after 3 successful voyages, ran into mechanical trouble. The Cape Corrientes' next trip was a loss maker, and both ships were hit by a dramatic slump in the freight market. By 1908, the two companies were in bad shape and were wound up a few years later, but in historical terms they left behind a remarkable legacy of Victorian enterprise, which took the names of 2 small Colne Valley textile communities into ports all over the globe. A little further along still, we come on our right to the Conservative Club and the Rose and Crown pub. On the opposite side of the road is a small group of cottages, which deserves its own niche in the history of Golcar. About 100 years ago, the cottages were bought by a number of wealthy village worthies and turned into a private club, which very soon became known as the House of Lords. Among the elite band of club members was the highly respected GP, Dr. Webster, a prominent figure in the public life of Golcar. At the turn of the century, Socialists were just beginning to gain a political foothold in Colne Valley. At one local election in the village, they caused an upset when their candidate, John Iredale Swallow, defeated Dr. Webster against all expectations. Such was the fury of the esteemed doctor and his drinking pals that they are reputed to have opened the back door of the club and hurled a barrel of beer down a sheer rock face, with one of them shouting, "That's the end of the House of Lords." The back door of the so-called House of Lords is now no more, but there remains a long row of windows, which Golcar folk called the sheet of pins, because that's what they looked like in bright sunshine. A little further along the road is the former Golcar Church School, now converted into flats. The school building dates back to 1865, although there was a smaller church school on the site from 1831. A new wing was added around 1890. I attended Golcar Church School until 1938, and going through the school records I came across some interesting snippets of historical interest. For instance, in July 1867, the weather was recorded as being fine and warm, and many children were busy with the haymaking. This reminded me of my own time there, when I missed school for a few days to help with the haymaking. There was no mechanisation before the war, and farmers relied on women and children to turn the hay with long wooden rakes. We worked from first light until dusk, and I was paid about 2 shillings a day, that's 10 new pence, and was allowed as much milk as I could drink. Also in July 1867, the records describe how a teacher took the children for a walk as far as the Upper Royal George public house on New Hay Road. The teacher said the children appeared to heartily enjoy themselves, playing cricket, skipping, racing, jumping, etc. And they got back home about 8 o'clock. I think you'll agree that was a long school day and a long walk. Hardly something that's likely to happen today. Another practice recorded in 1877 still existed when I was a pupil there. This was carrying warm dinners to their fathers in the mills. Many of my friends had to run home, eat their dinner, and then dash to the mill with a basin wrapped in a red spotted handkerchief. Sometimes I went with them, and I can remember going into the weaving sheds. The men who were on piecework ate as they worked. To stop the looms would have cost them money. If we had to go into the spinning room, we used to get a ride on the mule gate, a piece of machinery like a long, low gate, which moved backwards and forwards as the wool was drawn and spun. My father worked as a carding engineer at Victoria Mills, which as a girl I knew as Golcar Mill, because it was by far the biggest employer in the village. The mill was built in 1854, and by 1913, when it was owned by Pearson Brothers, it had 9,000 spindles and 82 looms. It had a sister mill in Slathwaite and a town office in Huddersfield. In the First World War, the firm made uniforms for the armed forces. The mill closed as a manufacturing unit during the textiles decline of the 1960s, but has been given a new lease of life by Drake's Fibres Limited, Britain's leading producers of polypropylene fibre, whose factory is one of the most technically advanced in Europe. We descend the steps, turn right and walk as far as we can, turning left at the end to follow the narrow ginnel down to James Street. We discover along the way how true it still is today that you can step off the path almost straight onto the roofs of cottages built into the steep hillside. The fact that virtually all these cottages have stone roof tiles rather than slate ones has probably saved them from considerable damage down the years as children hop from one house to another along the rooftops. At the foot of the steep slope on our left-hand side is the Wheel Public House, formerly called the Railway, which, as the name implies, was built to deal with trade generated by the trains when the rail track was built along the Colne Valley. I remember as a girl seeing the men from Golcar Mill clog dancing outside the pub after finishing work for the week on a Saturday dinner time. Crossing James Street and taking the second turning left down Station Road, we come on our right-hand side to a rather impressive carriage drive leading to the Baptist Church. The drive was made in 1904, after the Baptists rented the land opposite their chapel to avoid the possibility of houses being built there and spoiling people's view of the chapel's handsome facade. As we look along the drive, it's not difficult to conjure up a picture of horse-drawn carriages arriving in style at the chapel with families dressed up in their Sunday best. In those days, the chapel was a huge and impressive building, erected in 1869 to replace its smaller predecessor dating back to 1835, which was converted into a Sunday school. The new chapel was closed in 1970 because of the growing cost of maintaining such a large building. The Sunday school, dating back to 1896, was then made into a dual-purpose building and is still used as such today. Meanwhile, amid some controversy, the giant 1869 chapel was pulled down in 1977 to mark the end of a golden era for the Golcar Baptists. Their splendid three-storey giant was a representation of nonconformist chapel-going on a grand scale. The chapel was capable of seating 1,200 people, and it was often full on occasions such as the anniversary or special musical services with visiting singers of national fame such as Isabel Bailey, Walter Widdop and Heddle Nash. The chapel had the distinction of having services broadcast on both BBC radio and television. In September 1938, evening service went out live on the radio, and exactly 25 years later, in 1963, the Sunday evening TV programme, Songs of Praise, came from a packed chapel. Choral singing has been a feature of the church's history. The chapel was fortunate to have a long-standing musical partnership between George Stead as choirmaster and Irving Parkin as organist. In 1968, they celebrated 40 years of music making in tandem, but sadly both died within a few months of each other soon afterwards. The inspiring leadership of George Stead, who was also the noted conductor of Colne Valley Male Voice Choir, was continued by his erstwhile singing student Roy Firth, who had combined the duties of organist and choirmaster for the last 30 years until his death only a few months ago. The cleared site of the demolished chapel is now used as a car park, alongside which stands a stone taken from above the door to serve as a permanent reminder of what was a true colossus among Colne Valley's many chapels. Today, the chapel remains a flourishing nonconformist beacon, with organisations that include the Sunday School, the Women's League, Tuesday Forum, a youth club and a preschool playgroup. Talking about the youth club reminds me of a similar venture which my mother and aunt helped to get off the ground in another part of Golcar when I was in my teens. Just before the club opened, I was due to be baptised in the Baptist chapel. Part of the floor was taken up, as indeed it is today, to reveal a pool with steps going down into the water from both sides. The candidates stood next to the parson, who led them into the water. Here they were dunked and led out by helpers up the steps at the other side. I'd been to classes to prepare me for the ordeal, but honestly, I didn't understand what was going on. Mother had made me a long white shift with a girdle of thick cord, and there were small lead weights in the hem of my shift so that it wouldn't balloon up in the water. Well, there I was, and there the parson was, and then I put the cat among the pigeons. I blurted out, "I'm not going to do it," and walked away, all in front of the entire Thompson clan, who had gathered to see me baptised. Grandmother made a sound like a steam train, but I was past caring. There was an almighty row, but I was allowed to carry on as a member of the chapel children's choir, in the hope that I'd be ready for baptism the following year. But after this fiasco, the chapel elders found out that I had started singing with a dance band called the Sunrise Swintet, and finally I was thrown out of both the choir and the church. We don't associate the Baptist church with beer drinking these days, but way back in the middle of the 19th century, the chapel was actually brewing beer to drink at its many social functions. Official records show that among the list of provisions bought by the church in those days were malt and hops for beer making, which cost 4 shillings and 6 pence, equivalent to about 23 pence in today's money. The present Baptist minister in Golcar, the Reverend Mike Smith, agrees that it might seem odd that a nonconformist chapel should be making beer, but the temperance movement had not then taken off, and beer drinking in moderation was apparently not frowned upon. At the same time, the chapel bought a shilling's worth of tobacco for smoking at church functions. As we look out over the chapel graveyard, it is sad to recall that 6 of the 12 recorded burials there over 100 years ago were of children under the age of 10. In 1845, one of the people buried there was a local character called Tobacco John Hurst, aged 46, from the poorhouse, which used to be situated in Pyclaw. From the chapel we walk up the hill to the main road and cross over into Cartop Lane. As we approach the top of Cartop Lane, we see in front of us the parish church, dedicated to St. John, which dates back to 1829. The design is virtually identical to that of Linthwaite Parish Church, which can be seen across the valley, and which was built only a year or 2 earlier. Both churches were designed by Peter Atkinson of York, and another important link is that they were built with money from £1 million set aside by the government for the specific purpose of erecting new churches throughout the country. The cash was part of a war indemnity payment made to this country after the Battle of Waterloo by Austria, which curiously had been our ally in the Napoleonic Wars. No money came from our enemy France. It would seem that the payment was made as a gesture of gratitude for saving Austria from defeat. The clock in the church steeple was the gift of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Taylor of Marketplace, Golcar, who gave it in 1897 to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Golcar Church had an attractive lich gate made of oak with a roof of red tiles for 70 years, until it had to be pulled down in the late 1970s because of its poor condition. Among some remarkable characters to have been associated with the church was Iredale Hanson, the verger and sexton for 46 years, who was born before the church was built. A reputedly true story tells how he was digging a grave in the dark when he heard the sound of approaching clogs. Popping up from his hole, Iredale asked, "What time is it, lad?" But the only reply was a gasp and the sound of running feet as a terrified young mill worker beat a hasty retreat. Another great Golcar Church worker was Oscar Herbert Walker, a blind bell ringer for 58 years, who earned a living by hawking tea from door to door. When he was knocked down at Linthwaite, he was unable to ring the bells for a while, and a group of young lads volunteered to stand in for him. Disaster struck when the bell rope fell off, but luckily one of the boys was an agile young chap who ran up the ladders to the bell loft and pushed the bell by hand. We're not sure whether Oscar ever found out about their little secret. The early vicars of Golcar lived in a house known as Cliff Ash Parsonage, which is now number 5 Town End, until the present vicarage was built in 1862. As we drop down to the museum at the end of our walk, we've just time to pop into Cliff Ash Fisheries, who, according to the connoisseurs, make some of the best fish and chips in the whole of Yorkshire. And of course, we eat them in the way to enjoy them most, out of the wrapping paper and in the fresh air.